Hi everyone, this is an online lecture for week 3 in which we'll focus on professional reasoning, which as you know is a key part of this course, and we're going to focus particularly on the work of Mattingly and Fleming, which is the book chapters that you have to read, and we'll spend quite a bit of time talking about their findings from the research project, which we'll talk a bit about now. So this work came out of a jointly funded study by the American Occupational Therapy Association and the American Occupational Therapy Foundation, who funded a fairly large study to look at the clinical reasoning, was the term they used, the clinical reasoning of occupational therapists in the mid-80s. So it started around 1986. And it was timely because there hadn't been much published. There had been one paper published on the reasoning of occupational therapists during the assessment stage, working with people, I think it was living in the community with physical disability. So there had been one published research, but actually very little was known about how occupational therapists reasoned in practice. It was also the case that around that other professions, particularly medicine and nursing and dentistry to a lesser extent, had quite a bit of expertise and knowledge around how those professionals reasoned in practice. And so there came a time where the American OT Association and Foundation felt it was appropriate and timely for occupational therapy to investigate that aspect of professional practice. The study started and was led by two individuals, Cheryl Mattingly and Nedra Gillette. Cheryl Mattingly isn't an occupational therapist, but is an anthropologist, but has, since this study, had very close links with occupational therapy, and in fact still holds an academic position in an occupational therapy department at the University of Southern California. At the time, she was doing her doctoral studies and had experience of understanding the reasoning of other professional groups, such as air traffic controllers. Nedra Gillette was the second person who managed the project. Nedra is an occupational therapist and had worked at the American Occupational Therapy Foundation as their director of research. So those were the two people who first started the study. Then not long after, the third person, Maureen Fleming, joined, and Maureen Fleming is an occupational therapist. Now, as you will see in the chapter, the study that took place happened in one institution, an acute care hospital in Boston, I think it was, about 900 beds. There were about 14 therapists in the department, and some of those started off in the study, but more and more joined as the study progressed. One of the things that they're really clear about in this book, which was the first published book with the findings, although they had published work, and you'll see some of those articles in the American Journal of OT in 1991, there was a special edition. What they're very clear about is the book presents a conception of clinical reasoning that grew out of the research that they undertook with those occupational therapists at that time. And you'll hear more about the methodology, and it's in the book chapter you have to read, but one of the things that I think is interesting is the way that study took place, which we'll talk about in a second, but also that this way of thinking does resonate with other occupational therapists. And hopefully you'll see some examples throughout the rest of the semester, and when you start going on placement with occupational therapists, that this way of thinking does make sense and is applicable across a whole range of settings and institutions. But they just put that proviso out there in terms of these are the results of a research project. One of the things that I think is really interesting, which they talk about in the book chapter, and I think is a strength of this project, of this work, is that this was a study of real people, real occupational therapists, in their everyday work. So as you'll see in the book chapter, Mattingly and Fleming particularly spent time in the occupational therapy department with the occupational therapists. They observed sessions, they sat in at lunch, they walked down the corridors, had coffee, went to birthday parties, did all of those things, and used all of those experiences as a way of understanding what the therapist thought about and how they thought about their practice. So I think that's important in that this wasn't a type of study where it was we come up with a theory about X and we go out and see if it fits. This very much is going the other way. So practice provided this theory of professional or clinical reasoning. Two of the things which some of that can be explained by are the research methods that were used in this study. So it was ethnographic methods, and it became an action research project. So the ethnographic methods probably came from Cheryl Mattingly, being the anthropologist, and that generally includes things like participant observation, as I've just said, spending time engaging in whatever the participants are, so observing but also doing with them, in-depth interviews, and also videotaping. And it became an action research project because the therapists more and more became involved, but more and more they became co-researchers. So it wasn't just that Mattingly and Fleming were observing what was happening. The therapists started to come to Mattingly and Fleming and come to some of the discussions and group sessions with particular issues they wanted to discover and talk about. And so action research, it became action research in that they became co-researchers. It became a collaborative event, process. And so I think those two things are what makes it, the method, really interesting, but also gives more credence to the research finding, to the results. So in terms of what they actually did in this study, so they said they went through three phases. First of all was just what they call naturalistic observation, and that was that stuff I was just talking about in terms of just being part of the occupational therapy department, sitting in on lunches, team meetings, observing sessions, doing all those sorts of things, but participating as well as appropriate. They also engaged in quite a bit of interviewing and videotaping of client sessions, interviews with clients and interviews with therapists. So there was lots of that. And then after that, data analysis to look for themes as to what was going on. So a fairly long process with multiple stages. In terms of the particular methods, as I said, participant observation, in-depth interviews with therapists and with clients, and I think that's interesting, and also videotaping clinical sessions between therapists and clients that they then used as a basis for some of those discussions and interviews with the therapist particularly. So quite a range, took a long time, so they were exposed to what was going on and were able to check and refine and all of those sorts of things. So strong research in that sense. Some of the things that I think are interesting in that first chapter, which do help us make sense of what happens in occupational therapy and starts to give a bit of a window into how complex it is. They talked a lot about this sense of getting stuck, that therapists got stuck in terms of what to do and how to do things with particular clients or with clients. And I think that was something that was surprising to the therapists, but it was interesting nonetheless, that this idea of getting stuck and having to find a way to move forward. The other thing, which I know we've mentioned a bit, but also they found in this study, was the immense assumptions, number of assumptions that occupational therapists made and sometimes had to make in order to engage a client. And they talk about a bit of that in the chapter. One of the other things which I think is really interesting, and it does explain the results, which we'll touch on really briefly soon, is this idea that when they first started analysing the data and thinking about what they were seeing and what they were part of, they couldn't see a single way of thinking. There was no one particular way that all therapists thought about their practice in all situations with all clients. And so if you remember last week, I showed a picture in the online slide of a bubble inside someone's head in terms of their thinking process, and it was very messy. And that's what this captured, I think, is that there were lots of things going on, but they were able later on to work out some different ways of conceptualizing that. One of the things I also think is really important is, and if you remember, one of the aims of this program is for you to be theory driven, is their recognition that a grounding in theory, so a strong understanding of theory of practice and the different theories that occupational therapists can draw on, is essential for expert practice, but it doesn't guarantee expert practice. And I think that's really important for a number of reasons. One is it really highlights what we talked about at the beginning of the semester in terms of reflection. So you can know a lot about theory, but that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be a very strong practitioner. You need it to be an expert practitioner, but without reflecting on practice and other things, which we'll talk about, it doesn't mean you're going to be an expert practitioner. But also, which I know some people struggle with, is the idea that because we're client-centered and occupation-based, both of those things mean that it's a very individualized approach, or should be a very individualized approach. And so this idea that we need theory, but theory doesn't explain or provide for expert practice. And so they talked about or recognized that there are two types of reasoning. Theoretical reasoning, which I've just touched on and started to introduce, is the idea that we know with a particular condition that there are likely signs and symptoms and prognosis and all those sorts of different aspects of the condition. And that's that theoretical reasoning. So theoretical reasoning is very much about what are the generalities, what are the commonalities in that particular condition. So we know, for example, that somebody who's had a left-sided stroke, if we looked up in a textbook, we could list off the typical signs and symptoms of a left-sided stroke in a particular part of the brain, which tells us something and does guide the way that we think about what we might do with somebody who has a condition of that type. But practical reasoning helps us make that specific to the individual. So while theoretical reasoning might say, for example, that someone will have left-sided or right-sided weakness, I've forgotten which side of the brain I was talking about, but has one-sided weakness, practical reasoning will help us to think about, well, what does that mean for this particular person who's sitting in front of me at this particular time? What does weakness on that side of the body mean for her or him? Okay, so theoretical is a general, practical is thinking about the individual and making it specific to that person. The other thing that practical reasoning includes is what is the good thing or the right thing to do. And so we start to think about what are some of the ethical decisions that have to be made in practice with a particular client at a particular point in time. And I really think these two approaches, theoretical reasoning and practical reasoning, are really worth thinking about in terms of in order to be an expert practitioner, you certainly need the theory, but you also need these skills and abilities in practical reasoning, which is actually quite difficult. So clinical reasoning in occupational therapy, one of the other things which I think is really interesting, and again we've touched on this a bit last year, is that in this study, in the American OT Association and Foundation study, Mattingly and Fleming found or realised, uncovered that occupational therapists really thought about things in two ways. One was the biological world of the disease, and so they knew and thought about signs and symptoms, prognosis, anatomy, physiology, all of those sorts of components. But what they also what they also thought about was the meaning that the meaning of life for the people, the clients, the patients they were working with. And there's a really good chapter in their book which talks about this a bit more in the two levels almost of practice, that we did both of those things, and that often occupational therapists in practice, particularly in ward rounds, would talk about that biological way of thinking about things, but the undercover practice that they rarely spoke about but were very skilled at doing was looking at that meaning, the world of human meaning for that person. So I think that's a really interesting distinction and one we'll think about some more. Some of the other interesting bits I want you to pay a particular attention to in the book chapter are these things, and again we have talked a bit about these. This idea of tacit knowledge, so giving, I think the chapter section is called giving unfamiliar names to familiar concepts or something like that, but this idea that occupational therapists had a lot of knowledge which they became second nature and found it hard to articulate. That's the idea of tacit knowledge. Meaning making, as we've sort of touched on, picking up on that, understanding the human world of meaning. And also they recognised in the study, and we'll talk about this in narrative reasoning particularly, is that occupational therapists were very skilled at making sessions meaningful for clients. And if you think back to year one, the nature of occupation, it's not surprising why that should be a key feature. And then this idea of common sense, which again we've talked about, but I just want you to pay particular attention to those in the book chapter. So in terms of the sorts of reasoning we're going to talk more about over the next few weeks, I just want to give you a really brief touch on all of those. The two key ones that came out of the clinical reasoning study are narrative reasoning and three-track reasoning. So narrative reasoning is that sort of reasoning which therapists use, which involves stories, and it involves storytelling and story making. So storytelling, there were two types of storytelling. One was the sorts of stories that therapists told, often with other health professionals, and was what they called chart talk. So it was a very biomedical perspective. But then the storytelling was the other sort of storytelling was when they were getting stuck and having to work out what to do with this particular client at this particular point in time. That's when they use that sort of storytelling. And story making links back to the meaning making, that therapists were quite skilled at making stories with clients, and that didn't necessarily mean sitting down and telling stories, making stories verbally or writing them down, but creating experiences which pointed towards a future direction, a future story, a future outcome for the client or person they were working with. So that's narrative reasoning. Three-track reasoning was another sort of reasoning, but you will see these are, in some ways, slightly different ways of talking about similar types of reasoning, but we're going to talk about all of them. Three-track reasoning was this idea that there are three different ways that occupational therapists use. Procedural reasoning covered all of the procedural, factual, knowledge-based ways of thinking about clients and their conditions and their prognosis. So this is that stuff of some of that theoretical reasoning I mentioned before about someone with a stroke or someone with depression. There are certain common signs and symptoms. There are common treatment approaches. And for occupational therapy, there are common particular ways, things we might need to do with them to support them. Interactive reasoning, what is that reasoning which happens usually during face-to-face sessions, and it includes things like the use of humour, using your interactive interpersonal skills to understand how well a session is going, and also to engage with the client and get them really participating in therapist as a partner. And finally, conditional reasoning is thinking about the whole condition. And that is the whole condition and how it affects the whole group of people, not just the person with the condition, but also the longer term and the broader perspective of conditional reasoning. And I think, as I was just talking there, and I'd like you to have a think about how what you did last year, particularly, links in with procedural, interactive, and conditional reasoning. There are things we've done, you've done, that touch on all of those things. And then finally, ethical reasoning. And often this can be really hard in terms of working out what is the best thing to do or what is the right thing or the good thing to do, but it is an important one nonetheless, and often is more complicated and more challenging to think about. So they're the things we'll be thinking about over the next few weeks and this semester particularly, and we're going to spend quite a bit of time on each one of those so that you can become really skilled and knowledgeable in those. So that's a bit about the American OT Association, American OT Foundation Clinical Reasoning Study, and the book chapter obviously tells you a bit more, but they were some of the key highlights I wanted you to get out of it. So I will see you in class.